racism is becoming less and less of a barrier for the most talented and ambitious people of the world. But the progress is giving way to a more polarizing form of discrimination against the less talented people of every race. And that's why Marxist ideology is on the rise. Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. I'm Luis Razo, the director of EISM and host of this channel. In today's video, we're going to cover some politically sensitive topics, so I'd like to start by making two statements, one about human dignity and a second about human intelligence. Before I do that, however, I'd like to remind you that this channel isn't just another ideologically motivated opinion channel. The last thing the world needs is another opinion, and least of all mine. The primary goal of this channel is to propose a better, more effective, and more scientific way to resolve our differences of opinion. This question of how to better resolve our differences of opinion rests on a higher and more important level of abstraction than any other question facing humanity. I hope you keep that in mind as we wade through the messy contemporary landscape. And I hope you'll hang on till the end because I'm going to propose an actual solution. The proposal hinges on a critical but not very well understood difference between the Anglo and Judeo-Spanish conceptions of human nature. These diverged sharply, starting in the 16th century, and coincided roughly with the discovery of the Americas. Before we begin, I'd like to make a mission statement. It involves my firm commitment to the fundamental dignity of every human, without exception, even those who violently disagree with my conception of reality. Unlike other mission statements, however, mine isn't based on any traditional ethical framework. Instead, it's based on a physical and mathematical symmetry between animal brains and the physical and mathematical structure of the natural world. If you'd like to know more about the conjectured symmetry, please refer to our inaugural lecture. Today's video, in some sense, is a continuation of that initial lecture, and as far as I know, it's the first attempt ever to base human dignity on physics. The second statement I want to make involves an all too common misconception regarding human intelligence. Unfortunately, in this upside-down world of ours, intelligence has come to be virtually synonymous with a person's worth, as if people who are more intelligent or more outwardly successful are somehow more morally praiseworthy than people who are less intelligent or less outwardly successful. This is hardly ever the case. In fact, a person's intelligence and outward success, generally speaking, is inversely proportional to their moral worth. This often overlooked truth is captured in umpteen ways in the literary and philosophical classics of virtually every tradition, but its most famous manifestation is found in the Gospel of Matthew, where we're told that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to get into heaven. Fortunately, as the same gospel points out, there are exceptions to this counterintuitive rule. Those exceptions notwithstanding, it's important for me to clarify that high intelligence is in no way synonymous with virtue, and low intelligence in no way takes away from a human being's inherent dignity. With those two statements out of the way, let's turn to our main question, which is whether or not systemic racism exists. For the vast majority of people in the world, the instinctual answer to this question is obviously yes. However, a growing number of conservative minorities are carving out prominent careers for themselves based on the idea that systemic racism no longer exists. There are reasons to agree and disagree with this. On the one hand, it's certainly true that in the developed world, race is much less of an impediment to social and economic success than it has ever been in the past. the election of Barack Obama to the presidency of the US, and the growing number of superstar blacks in sports, entertainment, business, politics, and science is compelling proof of this fact. At the same time, conservatives are wrong to insinuate that because some minorities have been successful, everybody has an equal chance of success if they simply adopt conservative values. This is a self-serving non sequitur that stems from a willful disregard for the unequal distribution of human talent. This lack of appreciation for human differences has crept into the thinking of the intellectual elite on both sides of the political spectrum for the same basic reason, because both sides are trying to fatten their own pockets and further their own careers. This isn't to say, however, that both sides are equally self-interested. Assuming that people are equal at anything except dignity is an example of an all too common error that I'll refer to as the Enlightenment Equality Fallacy. Let's analyze where this fallacy comes from and why it's so common. The idea that people are equal, and its much more pernicious corollary, the idea that everybody should have an equal say in public policy, is a mistake that has a popular origin in ancient Greece. The surprisingly destructive effects of this seemingly innocuous idea, which Plato and Aristotle warned their readers about, have come down to us from antiquity through the Protestant Reformation and through a number of its intellectual offspring. One of the most incorrigible and pernicious of these offspring is John Locke's idea that humans are born equal as blank slates that can be easily molded. Combine Locke's erroneous conception of human beings as blank slates with Adam Smith's conception of an invisible hand that guides individual self-interest toward the eternal benefit of the public good, and you have the recipe for the unraveling of Western civilization through Marxist ideology. A clear sign that these two Anglo ideas are ill-conceived is the fact that modern elites on the left have come to believe that humans can be socially engineered for personal profit. The left doesn't refer to its own goals as personal profit, of course. They refer to them as social justice, and some of the leaders on the left command annual public salaries of more than $500,000, every dollar of which is accepted, of course, in the name of their poor and dispossessed comrades. On the other side of the political aisle, conservative intellectuals, like the good religious business folk they tend to be, believe that the desire for personal profit among the political and business elite is easily channeled toward the public good through a series of relatively simple administrative checks and balances. Well, relieve yourself in one hand and wish in the other. The recent triumph of Marxist ideology in American universities, the growing social disorder, and the calls to defund the police after more than half a century of some of the most sweeping and successful human rights advances in the history of the world seems to suggest that both of these conceptions of human nature, the progressive and the conservative, are naive at best and fatally flawed at worst. The problem is, they're both founded on the Enlightenment Equality Fallacy. Thomas Sowell, one of the most prominent conservative intellectuals of the past 2.5 generations in the US, has railed against the Enlightenment Equality Fallacy throughout his career. Let's listen.
Groups are different from each other in umpteen ways, and to have the presumption that they are the same except for the way they're treated is nonsense. It's never been true, and I don't know why we would think it's true here today.
When it comes to explaining group differences in academic performance, however, Sowell, who is obviously an incredibly gifted thinker, prefers to believe that people are born equal. He attributes differences in IQ to culture. Let's hear him out.
Now, how, in fact, is one to distinguish between that which is genetic and that which is so impacted culturally that it might almost have that effect?
I guess that my emphasis would, of course, be on the cultural.
Again, notice how Sowell insists that groups are different, but when it comes to IQ, he switches up and suggests that groups are equal. Later in his career, with the overwhelming evidence that has been presented against his position, Sowell appears to have more trouble with this question. Here's how he responds in 2013.
Is there a relationship between, or an important relationship between, race and mental capacity?
Well, capacity if you mean by capacity potential, then who knows? Because you can't measure potential currently, and I suspect for the next 100 years or so probably. But what you can recognize and measure is capacity, developed capabilities. You can measure those with SATs and stuff like that. But potential you cannot.
So when it comes to race, how does that play into the measurements that we have today?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Is there a correlation between IQ, what we have and what we're able to measure today, and race?
Oh, sure. I mean, there's always been among all sorts of groups around the world.
If that was hard to follow, don't assume it was you. Sowell is almost always brilliant, and I really enjoy his work. But when it comes to this particular issue, he contradicts himself. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and hope to eventually talk to him or anybody willing to defend his position. But as far as I can tell, his dilemma stems from the fact that if he accepts the idea that IQ is partly genetic, as experts unanimously agree, then his conservative argument loses force and he has to see his position for what it is, self-serving and self-interested, which is what he has always accused his leftist adversaries of being. To understand Sowell's moral dilemma, let's walk through a thought experiment. Imagine a society where the quality of a person's life, their safety, their ability to buy a home, go on vacation, and send their children to the best schools depended on their basketball skills. In this society, if a person is not very good at basketball, there are lots of basketball camps available, even on nights and weekends. Then imagine a professional basketball player telling everybody in that society that in order to compete in the pros, all they need to do is be more patriotic, improve their dribbling skills, and work really hard. Needless to say, many people would quickly understand that they don't stand a chance at basketball. The more compliant citizens would continue to dribble as best they could, knowing that something wasn't right. But a small fraction of them would discover Marx and begin to plot the overthrow of the system. This is roughly analogous to what's happening now in the US with intelligent, articulate, outgoing, and ambitious conservatives like Larry Elder and Candace Owens, trying to sell competitive, pull yourself up by the bootstrap values to people of all races who are naturally disadvantaged at a game they're not interested in playing. What prominent conservatives are reluctant to talk about is the fact that the average IQ of Black and Latino Americans, by which I mean people of mixed Spanish and indigenous blood, is well below the national average. If this sounds like an insult, it's not. Intelligence is not a measure of moral worth. So get that notion out of your head because it's not helping anybody. The undeniable empirical fact is that racial disparities in IQ have been well established among educators and professional psychometricians for decades. The American Psychological Association, which is a paragon of progressivism, has issued a formal statement to this effect. I'll put a link to it in the description. The fact that highly gifted Black and Latino conservatives are so willing to turn their backs on the most naturally disadvantaged members of their own families and race, to claim, out of pure self-interest, that systemic racism does not exist, in my view, is about as contrary to the foundational values of Western civilization as you can get. I'm reminded of a twisted conservative version of the story of Moses, where instead of killing an Egyptian and having to flee Egypt for it, Moses kills a few of his fellow Jews and gets a Mercedes-Benz. I can imagine this conservative Moses saying to Pharaoh, "Let my people go to hell." Don't think, however, that this is strictly a minority issue. In the US, in terms of absolute numbers, there are far more intellectually disadvantaged whites who are affected in the same way by the same forces. And it's not just the poor. According to the Department of Justice, high-achieving Asians and whites are being systematically discriminated against in Ivy League college admissions. Something is obviously amiss here, and the problem is rooted in the Enlightenment Equality Fallacy. Public figures on both sides of the political aisle refuse to talk about the reality of human differences in IQ because it undermines the false conception of equality on which their narratives and salaries are based. Let's analyze both of these narratives. On the screen is the well-established distribution of IQ scores for different groups. As you can see, there is significant overlap among all the groups. The biggest differences are found at the extremes, so let's focus on each of these. At the low IQ end of the graph, we can see that if any specific social policy harms people with low IQ, whether that policy is progressive or conservative, Blacks and Latinos are disproportionately negatively affected. By and large, this is what we see in the US as a whole, with Blacks and Latinos suffering disproportionately from things like poverty, disease, obesity, and the prison industrial complex. At the other end of the spectrum, if any specific policy is advantageous for people with high IQs, whether that policy is progressive or conservative, Jewish people disproportionately benefit from that policy. By and large, this is what we see across many different systems and cultures, with the Jews having a totally disproportionate presence at the top levels of virtually every branch of human activity, from business to the arts to the sciences and everything in between. In a sentence, the Jews appear to be nature's chosen people, which explains why they're often targeted by less accomplished groups. Conservatives respond to this reality by arguing that people are equal and anybody who isn't just needs to try harder, like the people in our imaginary basketball city just needed to improve their dribbling skills to compete in the NBA. On the other side of the aisle, progressives argue that people are equal, but it's a different kind of equality, one that government needs to mold, which is what progressives are for, to mold that equality, for a small fee, of course. It doesn't matter if that equality is never reached. What matters is the small fee. If you doubt that, just ask any progressive politician to cut their own salary as a measure of their concern for the poor, and see how fast you get a big middle finger. What I'm trying to say is that each side of the political spectrum uses the Enlightenment Equality Fallacy for its own ends, and these ends aren't always aligned with truth or reason or science. This is not the place to hammer out which side of the aisle is right, because there's a much more important point I want to make. And this is the main point of this whole exercise. So let me pause for emphasis. The fact is that even if we could use a magic wand to eliminate every environmental inequality and make everything absolutely equal for everybody, whether through progressive government programs or through conservative cultural changes, we're never going to change the statistical nature of reality. In fact, the more equal we make an environment, the more unequal things actually become. This is a counterintuitive fact that's baked into the physical and mathematical nature of reality. To explain what I mean, let's listen to a short clip from Jeff Tolleckson, director of the Institute for Quantum Studies at Chapman University, near my hometown in California. In the coming clip, Tolleckson explains what happens when you create two precisely identical atoms and subject them to the exact same physical environment. What he's going to talk about here is far, far more profound than today's topic, but it gets a really important point across about just how fundamental the Enlightenment Equality Fallacy really is. Again, what he's going to describe here are 100% exactly identical atoms exposed to 100% exactly the same environment. Let's listen.
Suppose you have two atoms and they start off with their electrons in an excited state. So at some point those electrons are going to decay and emit a photon. And the way they start out is 100% identical. The two atoms are exactly, precisely identical.
Even God couldn't tell the
Even God
difference.
can't tell the difference between these two atoms. And nevertheless, One of them will decay after, say, an hour, and the other, the second atom, which is identical, will decay after a minute. There was absolutely no difference between them in the beginning, yet they behaved completely differently later on.
Humans are not atoms, of course, but we're made of atoms, and the same polarizing principle, which can be seen in everything from the evolution of life on Earth to the expansion of the universe, can be seen in our social interactions as well. Before 1950, for example, overt institutional racism kept black players from participating in the NBA. Today, thankfully, those artificial barriers have been eliminated, and as a result, the league is now more racially unequal than it has ever been. And today's is a more entrenched kind of inequality, given that the difference in height between NBA players and the average person in 1950 was smaller than the difference between NBA players and the average person today. This natural polarizing process doesn't give a whit about the Enlightenment and takes over whenever we make the environment more equal in any way. Let me repeat that. This natural polarizing process doesn't give a whit about the Enlightenment and takes over whenever we make the environment more equal in any way. Every time we reduce political corruption or racial discrimination or any other kind of inequality, we're actually accelerating the underlying physical polarization. What does this mean for IQ? It means that even if we were able to magically eliminate every barrier to the full intellectual and cultural development of every person through whatever happens to be your favorite ideology, which is something I think we should continue to strive for, the fact is that we would not create more equality. We would actually create even more social and economic inequality than we started with. A prime example of this are the great successes of the civil rights movement, which are now giving way to a new multiracial upper class and to a new, more deeply entrenched multiracial underclass. The increasing polarization across all races is what's fueling the unexpected rise of Marxism across the Western world. If you haven't seen my interview with Charles Murray about this, I encourage you to watch it. I think you'll find it eye-opening. Don't take any of this to mean that promoting conservative values is a bad thing, any more than promoting discipline, exercise, and good nutrition is bad. The harm comes from the self-serving aspects of the lie that people are equal. People are not equal in anything except dignity. The fact is that there are countless millions of Americans of every race who have worked really hard but have not seen the social or economic return on investment that the cognitive elite on both sides of the political aisle have obtained for themselves and their families over the last several decades. From this perspective, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 makes perfect sense. Having for decades watched the intellectual and political elite transfer American wealth and industry out of their middle and lower class neighborhoods, Americans simply got tired of all the losing. Ironically, they came to believe that a billionaire could save them. Unfortunately, Donald Trump shows no signs of understanding that the biggest enemy of the United States is the Anglo conception of equality on which the country is founded. After all, it is precisely the Constitution that is giving Marxists the right to dismantle, one vote at a time, the principles on which the country is founded. The fact is that when the idea that all men are created equal made it onto the Declaration of Independence, that seemingly harmless choice of words permanently institutionalized a series of quasi-communist ideas that ignore one of the most logical things imaginable. If you want to keep your nation intact, you should not give an equal vote to the enemies of your nation. Had the Founding Fathers incorporated this basic truth into their vision, the U.S. would probably not be succumbing to Marxist ideology today. Let me wrap things up by saying that although systemic racism is obviously becoming less of a barrier for the most competitive and talented people of the world, the values of the Enlightenment are giving way to a more polarizing form of discrimination against the less competitive and less talented people of every race. which is ultimately what's driving the Marxist anger behind such movements as 15M, Occupy Wall Street, Extinction Rebellion, and Black Lives Matter. Unfortunately, the situation is likely to get a lot worse before it gets any better, precisely because the more success we have in making the world a better place, the more unequal and polarized we will actually become. This fact, that human progress inevitably leads to deeper and more lasting division, is likely to be the biggest challenge that humans face in this century. So what's the solution? Thankfully, there's an alternative to the truncated Northern European conception of equality. It goes back to the Old Testament tradition of men and women who are chosen, then challenged, and finally broken by their struggle with human nature. A tradition that traveled from ancient Israel to Greece and then spread throughout the Roman Empire, symbolized as a dead man on a cross. By the time this ancient Judaic spirit of inequality reached the Iberian Peninsula of the 16th century, the Spanish School of Salamanca applied it with great creative genius to the philosophical and economic questions of the day, leading to vastly different conceptions of human nature than those that emerged from the Reformation. If Adam Smith had read these Judeo-Catholic libertarians, he might have foreseen the problems with his labor theory of value, the principle on which Karl Marx later developed communism. Had Marx not repeated Adam Smith's communist error, maybe Western liberal democracy wouldn't be so haunted by the specter of forced collectivism today. At the same time, the solution we're looking for comes from the future, as manifest by the apocalyptic image of the Mother of God that emerged from Spain's arrival to the Americas. As we'll come to see, the spirit of self-sacrifice and racial and cultural integration, symbolized by this image, is diametrically opposed to the spirit of self-interest and racial superiority that led the Anglos to systematically decimate the indigenous people of North America. Ideas matter, and nowhere is a more compelling differentiation made between Anglo and Spanish ideas than in this image. You'll find a link to the story behind this image in the video description, but I'll have a lot more to say about it in future videos. In part 2 of this series, we're going to delve deeper into some of the latest advances in physics to do away with the quasi-communist, egalitarian voting principles that emerged from the Anglo Enlightenment. We'll then propose a much more logical and scientifically sound voting system based on free market competition, correctly and more completely understood. Until then, I welcome your comments, and if you or anybody you know would like to appear as a guest on the channel to discuss any of this, please let me know. I'm easy to reach. Thank you for your time. If you like what you heard, stick around and let's reason together.